In September of 1939, when the Second World War began, tens of thousands of men would be marching off to battle, leaving behind their wives, children, and loved ones. In their absence, life would change drastically for everyone who remained. In an effort to support their boys abroad, governments implemented new policies that declared total war, a battle overseas, and a battle on the home front. Food was rationed, supplies were recycled, and the government needed everyone on board in order to contribute to the war effort. The battle on the home front would be up to whoever was left to keep the country running. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Historadame, and today we're learning all about life on the home front during World War II. With all the young and able-bodied men off fighting in the war, a massive hole was left in the economy. Countries still needed workers to keep themselves running, not to mention the increased demand for supplies, weapons, and vehicles that the war required. Those who were left on the home front were the ones that had to step up to keep things going. In order to boost production, many factories raised wages to attract more workers. People from across all industries began to flock to these new positions in droves, leaving behind their old jobs as farmers or domestic servants to chase better pay and support their country. Among these workers included many people from marginalized groups, such as African Americans, and thousands of women who would be entering the workforce for the very first time. In the United States, the amount of women in the workforce jumped from 25% to 36% in the mid-1940s, with around 6 million women employed. Around the same time, the amount of female workers in Canada went from 570,000 women to over 1 million. Many of these women would be taking over roles in production for the war effort, roles that were previously exclusive to men, such as welders, electricians, and riveters. But not everyone was welcoming to these new workers. Though women and minorities were needed to make up the lost labor force, some were not happy to see them stepping into new types of employment. Women were paid less to do the same work that men did, and they often had any credentials they possessed overlooked and ignored. There was also a quiet understanding in place that these jobs would be temporary, and that the women would be ousted from the workforce in favor of men once they returned from the war. All of this was even more difficult for racial minorities, who were frequently rejected for higher-paying positions simply for the color of their skin. But despite the inequality, people still wanted to work, and they wanted to support their country. So they pulled up their socks and did the best that they could to keep production from falling apart. Employed work was not the only contribution that was made to the war effort, however. Those who did not find jobs helped in different ways, like volunteering. In response to food shortages, thousands of children and young women spent the summer doing low-paid jobs or volunteer positions in agriculture. Many others participated in scrap drives and the Salvage for Victory campaign, donating and recycling items that were needed for the war, such as metal, rubber, and paper. Even those who remained housewives did their part in providing for the army, by sewing quilts, clothing, or bandages for those overseas. It is often understated just how much work women did during the war. Not only were they getting jobs, but they were also participating in war-related volunteering. And they were doing all of this while still cooking, cleaning, and caring for their children. And as for work in the home, that came with its own problems. As the war raged on and more resources were required, countries involved imposed rations on their citizens in order to conserve supplies. Items on the ration list could span anywhere from everyday items like food and clothing, to larger purchases like cars. In order to work around these rations, campaigns were launched that encouraged people to do more with less. Some commonly rationed items included food products like sugar, coffee, tea, meat, and canned goods. Other products made from materials that were in high demand, like rubber and metal, also had strict limits put on the supply available for purchase. These included things like cars, nylon stockings, gasoline, metal toys, clothing, shoes, bicycles, and kitchen appliances. In order to keep track of rations, households would be given a small printed booklet that contained ration stamps, which essentially worked as a ticket in order to purchase items from the list. If you wanted to buy something, like a new pair of shoes for example, you had to first present the corresponding ration stamp to the store clerk in order to make your purchase. If you needed something and had no stamps left, you would have to wait until the next stamp booklet was handed out. Naturally, these kinds of restrictions prompted some people to try and find a loophole in the system. When there were talks about certain items being added to the list, some people would try to hoard as much of it as they could, in order to sell it for an inflated price later. Others would start illegal markets, where they sold rationed goods to people without ration stamps. These crimes were taken very seriously by the government, and those who were caught hoarding supplies could face severe fines or even time in prison. But overall, the average person found ways to stretch things as far as possible. During the war, there was a large emphasis on recycling and reuse. People found ways to work within the limitations of rationing by repairing clothing, recycling fabric to make new items, or cooking recipes that were designed to account for the constraints of rationed items like sugar. When supplies were particularly tight, people had to get more creative. Women who worked as secretaries, for example, had a very strict and feminine dress code that required nylon stockings. If the ones they had got ruined before they received more ration stamps, one solution that they came up with was to draw a seam up the side of their legs to give the illusion of wearing nylons. Pretty clever if you ask me. Food, of course, was needed to feed both the army and the citizens at home, so great care had to be taken in order to ensure that resources were well managed. With new research being developed in regards to health and nutrition, governments took great interest in making sure that everyone was eating a balanced diet. But eating healthy was easier said than done when households had to work around ration lists and restrictions. There was only so much of certain items that you could buy during a week, and things that were in higher demand could have increased prices. In order to get by, many people had to learn how to cook with ingredients that they might not normally have used, like molasses instead of sugar, organs instead of meat, or cutting out meat entirely in favor of other proteins. There were restrictions on prepared food as well, such as the government banning sliced bread or icing on cakes, with the one exception being those for weddings. Food rations brought forth new social norms and customs as well, such as the idea of having a meatless Tuesday, where even restaurants would serve an entirely vegetarian menu. The one type of food that was not rationed, however, was fresh fruits and vegetables. Even though food production was struggling due to a large amount of the workforce fighting in the war, the produce that would be shipped to the army was of the processed variety. Regardless, the government didn't want any extra strain on farmers, so citizens were encouraged to plant vegetable gardens of their own instead. Known as victory gardens, these community garden projects became incredibly popular during the war, being grown anywhere from backyards to window boxes. People were further encouraged to jar and preserve the food that they grew in order to stretch it longer during the cold months. Because of the easy access to fresh produce, many wartime recipes were vegetable-heavy and sometimes used unorthodox ingredients. In order to encourage healthy eating, local publications like newspapers, magazines, and cookbooks published recipes that helped people work around rationed items, stretching their ingredients further and teaching them how to use new foods that they had access to. Some popular recipes from this time include favorites like beans on toast, Duchess soup, which was a dish made from butter, onions, cheese, and milk, carrot cookies, or Lord Woolton pie, which used a lot of vegetables that were easily accessible through gardening. Despite the fact that food rationing drastically changed the way people were eating, it was actually for the better. Despite being limited on what they could make, the government's focus on nutrition and providing people with recipes that worked within their constraints had most families eating better than they ever had before. It was actually thanks to many of these wartime nutritionist movements that our current understanding of healthy eating was able to become widespread. The war would change life for everyone, not just those fighting on the front lines. With so much of daily life adjusted in order to contribute to the war effort, it was only natural that pop culture would also evolve with the changing times. Patriotism and war-related propaganda were everywhere, on the radio, and especially on posters that could be found in public spaces. Various government campaigns used propaganda posters to prompt citizens to participate in wartime efforts, like scrap drives, joining the workforce, enlistment, ride-sharing, or racism. People were also encouraged to show their patriotism by wearing pins, waving flags, or buying sweetheart jewelry, which was a line of jewelry that was made from plastic in order to conserve metal. It was also a way for some young women to show that they were off limits to potential suitors, as they were waiting for a boyfriend, fiancé, or husband who was fighting in the war. In an effort to get more funding for the army, the government also introduced the purchasing of war bonds. Even Hollywood was getting involved with inspiring the public towards patriotism. Those attending the cinema would be met with plenty of war-related content, including newsreels and propaganda cartoons that were played before the movie. Many film productions were also made to boost morale, such as wartime movies, but also military training videos and patriotic short films to encourage enlistment. Some actresses even posed for pinup photos that could be sent to soldiers overseas, in order to remind them what would be waiting when they got back home. The wartime attitude even slipped into the music industry, with patriotic tunes like the Andrews Sisters' hit Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy being played in American households all across the country. World War II was devastating for everyone involved, and social culture had to adapt accordingly. In some ways, this onslaught of patriotic initiatives helped people feel like they were working towards a common goal together. In other ways, it demonized certain groups and caused increased divisions in the country. While some elements of patriotism are certainly problematic, it's still important to note that for some people it was the only thing that kept them going. We always pay so much attention to those who fought in the war, and rightfully so, but sometimes we also need to remember those who were left behind, the people who did what they could despite difficult circumstances. Sometimes we need to remember the home front. Hey everyone, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. I loved researching for this one, especially the food portions, so if you've tried any of these wartime recipes, let me know. If you want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.